For years, I poured myself into designing creative programs that were physically and intellectually engaging, and they worked. I could see education happening right there in the middle of my museum programming. But to other people on staff, it just looked like kids were playing. My work with kids was often brushed aside as less important, less serious, or somehow less valuable. And the worst part is that tug of war between fun and real learning caused me to doubt everything I was doing. Was I wasting my time? Was I in the way of real work? Was play in the museum good, bad, or somewhere in the middle? When I was preparing for this episode, I saw a couple of Reddit posts that really brought all of this back to me. One was from someone who was genuinely angry that babies and toddlers were allowed in, quote, non-kid friendly museums. And then other posts were asking people about things to do with kids in a new city. And there were so many responses that would say, oh, try this museum or that museum because they have kid spaces, but beware, their exhibits aren't for kids at all. As someone who worked for a long time in a museum without a dedicated kid space and talked a lot about difficult topics, looking at posts like those might have made me at the time feel like my work really was wasteful, or even worse, that it was detracting from good museum work. And I know that I am not alone in feeling this tension. In fact, a couple of years ago, I did a research project where I asked fellow museum educators, what do you think about play and learning and the appropriateness of play in museums? And what I found from my experience and what I noticed in theirs is that most museum educators, and perhaps you as well, feel a deep tension regarding play in museums. If you have ever led a field trip on a tough subject, waited on a school bus that was 20 minutes late, or bounced straight from a toddler storytime program into an impromptu meeting with a board member, you're in the right place. I'm Rachel, a museum education researcher, consultant, and creative partner for small but mighty education teams who feel a little stretched thin, but know this job is worth it. This podcast is where museum education scholarship meets real-world realities, helping you reclaim your creativity, energy, and maybe even your lunch break. Welcome to the Modern Museum Education Podcast. Hi, friends, and welcome back to the show. If we haven't met, I'm Rachel, the founder of Modern Museum Education. I'm a creative consultant for small and mid-sized museums, helping their educators to create sustainable, scalable, and pedagogically sound programs for children and families that won't have them burning the candle at both ends. Today, we're going to contrast that rigid view of play as a distraction from serious content with the idea of play as a learning avenue. And then we'll be able maybe to make some better decisions about when or how we should incorporate play into our programs. So as we jump into this, let's address the elephant in the room. Play is a huge opportunity for educators, but it is also hugely misunderstood in the museum field. A few years ago, I was doing an assignment for my qualitative research class, and I interviewed several museum educators about their perceptions and their experiences of play in museums. And overwhelmingly, they told me that museum education is naturally embodied and playful. Yet, they also expressed a constant tension regarding its use. Okay, now technically, this assignment was a project and not official research because it wasn't undertaken with IRB approval, which is the governing body within a university that oversees research and ethical research. So because of the lack of IRB approval, I can't publish these findings officially, but I can absolutely share with you my personal conclusions that I drew from these conversations. And I bet you can identify with a lot of these conclusions. I'm going to start by sharing a conclusion from this paper. Through their answers, participants offered viewpoints on play that were largely uncertain and even contradictory. While they felt strongly that play was beneficial, the chaotic nature of some play made them pause. Although they expressed great belief in the power of play, they acknowledge that in the context of reality, play is limited by a variety of factors. When addressing play's specific use as a teaching tool, the educators in this study, or i.e., project, were ambivalent about how expansively play should be used. Now, this was, of course, just a small set of museum educators in my immediate network. So let's take a look at what you think about the nature of play. I'm going to show you a series of photos that I actually showed to these museum educators that I spoke to, where I asked them to rank each image from no play, all learning, to all play and no learning. And the goal was to get a sense for what kinds of activities we naturally associate with play, with learning, and with playful learning. Okay, a quick note. If you are listening to this on an audio only platform, check out the show notes for a link to see these images, or you can just head over to YouTube to watch the video version of this episode. Okay, so let's go through these images together. Now, credit where credit is due. These images came from Canva, and I found them by searching for kids in museums and kids playing. And I just chose 8 that I felt were kind of indicative of maybe some of the activities that we do in museum education, and some that might cause us to think critically about where on the scale of play to learning we think these activities fall. Okay, so up first is an image of 2 kids that are playing with what looks like a giant light bright. And the question is, are they just playing, or are they playing and learning, or are they just learning? And if you were like me, you're going to say it's somewhere in between, that it is play, but they are learning through that play. And most of the educators that I talked to did actually agree with that. However, there was some discrepancy between about half of the educators I spoke with said, this is equal play and equal learning. And then others said, this is mostly play and some learning. So think about what your answer to that would be. How much play or how much learning, or somewhere in the middle, do you see when you look at these pictures? Okay, we're going to go on to the second picture. So in this picture, you see a couple of kids who are looking at an exhibit inside of a gallery, and it is clearly an exhibit that they can touch because they have their hands on the object. So hopefully it's a touching exhibit here. And the question is play, learning, or somewhere in between. And what was interesting is that most of the people I spoke to said this is some play, but mostly learning. And a few people said they're not playing at all, which is interesting because in other parts of that same project, those exact same educators said if they're touching it with their hands, they're playing. But then when they see a picture like this, they say, they're not playing, they're just learning. So you can start to see that there's some ambivalence, even amongst ourselves, about what play in a museum actually looks like. Here's another example. These are little toddlers on a floor playing with soft blocks. So are they playing or are they learning? And again, the educators I spoke with said, this is equal play and equal learning. Because of course, for toddlers, this is equal play and equal learning. Or in some cases, it's mostly play and some learning. And that's the other answer I got. Okay, so let's move on. Now, this one is the tricky one. There's 3 children, and they are clearly looking at an exhibit. One of them has a clipboard. One of them is writing something down. And 2 of them look very serious, and the third one has a big smile on her face. So are they playing or are they learning? Or is it both? And of course, the answer here depends on what exactly they're doing. So some of the educators said, well, if I'm going to assume that this is a scavenger hunt, I'm going to say it's a little bit of both. But without any context as to what's actually on this clipboard, this question split the vote. So for this question, most of the educators I spoke to said it was some play, but mostly learning. Whereas a couple of people said they're not playing at all, it's only learning. And other people said it's equal play and equal learning. So again, you can see there's tension even amongst educators as to what play looks like in a museum. Okay, so this is the last one we're going to look at. And in this one, you have a couple of kids who were playing with like giant bubbles. This is the kind of exhibit you would see at maybe a children's science museum or a children's museum. And what's interesting is that I think this is one of those really good examples. Whereas if I, in a history museum, had kids playing with bubbles, some of my colleagues would have said those are kids playing with bubbles. Whereas there might have been a perfectly tight connection between that playful activity and the subject that I was talking about. But in the context of a history museum, this might look just like play to some people. Whereas in the context of a science museum, you might say, oh, this looks more like learning. And I think that that might be part of the, the, the point of some of our tension is that museums are all kinds of things to all kinds of people. So clearly, there is a lot of tension over the nature of play in our museum spaces. And in this episode, we're not even going to touch on the appropriateness of play relative to subject matter, which is a huge topic. We're not even going to touch that one in this episode. We're only talking about the nature of play and whether or not it bolsters learning. And if so, how so? See, when we put some solid research behind us, we can begin to feel a lot more comfortable about using the idea of play and playful strategies, no matter what we're talking about or no matter what the content of our museum is. As you're listening to this, if you find yourself wondering how to actually incorporate playful learning without getting bogged down in some of the academia that I'm going to touch on here in just a moment, I invite you to come join us in the Engagement Lab. It's my free Telegram community, and you can find the link to join right in the show notes. So, what exactly is the connection between play and learning, and why do we feel this tension in the first place? One of the problems is that, as one researcher wrote in 2020, defining what we mean by play is a devilishly difficult task. And another researcher in 2016 wrote that we know play when we see it, basically. A very well-known play theorist named Brian Sutton Smith wrote in 1997, he was writing a book about how the prevailing sense of play in Western thought was that play is non-productive, play is voluntary, play is fun. Now, he, in this work and others, refuted this idea that this colloquial idea of play being entirely frivolous. However, that idea is still pretty pervasive in our culture. And in my opinion, that has a lot to do with something called childism. So, what in the world is childism? So, childism is a critical thought process that is similar to feminism. So, just as feminism uncovers pervasive patriarchal structures, childism exposes the deeply rooted adult-centric assumptions that govern how societies, institutions, and museums are pre-constructed. So I'm going to read kind of a lengthy quote, but I think it helps explain this idea. This is from a scholar named John Wall, and it comes from his study that he published in 2019. Childism focuses on transforming understandings and practices, not just around children themselves or even around child-adult intergenerality, but also around the pervasive normative assumptions that ground scholarship and societies overall. It suggests, in a similar way to recent forms of feminism, that the more fundamental problem for children and youth is not just how children and youth themselves are understood and related to, but, and this is the point, also the social and political foundations on which children's lives and experiences are already imagined and pre-constructed. Basically, what this means is that adult-centered ideas about what something should or should not be is the lens through which we understand children's experiences and behavior. This plays out in museums where you see people say, that exhibit is not for kids. This museum is not for kids. This space is not for kids, because we have preconceived, we've pre-constructed this social understanding of what a museum should or should not be. And also, we have pre-constructed an idea of what play is or is not. Does that make sense? So if we as adults think play is frivolous, and then we see a kid playing in a space that we associate with learning, that's going to feel incongruent. However, for a child, maybe it's not. And this is actually the whole point of my dissertation. I mentioned my dissertation in an earlier episode, but this is the reason why I could not pursue my original train of thought for my dissertation, because I kept running into this wall of what is it that kids are actually thinking when they're entering a museum. That's kind of beside the point. But what I'm trying to get you to realize here is that there is a different way to think about play than the way that we have always thought about it. If we think about it from a normative adult perspective, maybe we are limiting what play can mean, not just for kids, but also for adults. Okay, so how do we begin confronting childism in our work as museum educators? First, we can start by deconstructing these invisible rules. So if your space has a normative idea of what a visitor should or should not be, maybe it's quiet, maybe it's reflective, maybe it's stationary, maybe it's hands-off, maybe it's someone who learns your content only with their eyes. They're looking at exhibits, they're reading things. These kinds of normative expectations, which now, to be fair, we associate more with like older versions of museology, the way museums used to be a long time ago. But even still, those feelings are pervasive and they persist, as you can see, from maybe not so much from people in the field, but people in the public definitely have an idea of what museum exhibits can and cannot be. As in, you can, like I saw in those Reddit posts, why are there kids in this museum? Don't take your kids to this exhibit. Those kinds of comments are happening because the public has adopted this normative view of what a museum visitor is supposed to do. And that is not play. And so if we want to allow play into our museums, we have to start confronting that normative assumption. How do we do that? Well, we start by foregrounding children's perspectives. So this means shifting from just tolerating kids and moving towards actively constructing physical spaces in our museums and also pedagogical foundations in our programs so that kids and adults together can genuinely thrive. And this goes back to what I talked about last episode in episode 22 about fostering intergenerational learning. So if you haven't heard that episode, go back and take a listen. Now, by the way, if you think that your staff could benefit from some personalized hands-on training on how to handle play in your space and what play looks like for your museum, that's exactly the kind of work that I do with my professional workshops. So you can find the link in the show notes to read more about my workshop services and how we can work together to help your staff better understand this idea of play in the museum. Okay, so let's get back to what the main point here is. The point is, and this is something most museum educators can agree on, even if we feel the tension resulting from these childistic societal norms. We, as museum educators, most of us believe that play motivates learning. And this is grounded in some great research. So in case you start to get some pushback from people that play and learning don't go together, this is the part of the episode you want to send them to. Classic theorists like John Dewey, Lev Vygotsky, and Jean Piaget, to more recent museum education researchers like John Falk and Lynn Dierking and Eileen Hooper Greenhill, they all say the same thing. Personal motivation is the number one key factor in whether a person of any age actually learns anything. And by learning, what we mean is that they take in external sensory information through any combination of their senses, and they analyze it, they synthesize it, and they imprint that information directly into their brains. Now, granted, that is a massive oversimplification of what learning means. But for a brief-ish podcast, that's as deep as we're going to go today. The main point is this. Without personal buy-in, a person simply will not store information long-term in their brain. Now, there's other research that tells us, it confirms for us that play is one of the best ways to engage that personal motivation. And that is especially true for children. So let's look at what some of that research is. So first up is some research coming out of Harvard's Project Zero, which is a multifaceted research project into all these different elements of education. And within that big project, they have a smaller project called the Pedagogy of Play. And that is a really valuable resource. If you don't know about the Pedagogy of Play, I'll put a link to it in the show notes. You should definitely look it up. In that research, they're specifically looking at play as an educational tool. And what they found is that across cultures, play supports learning through three particular avenues. One is that when a child leads their own learning, they're exercising autonomy. That's playful learning. When they are exploring the unknown, fostering wonder, that's playful learning. And when they are finding joy and delight in what they are doing and learning, that is playful learning. And if there are three things that we do in museum education a lot, it's encourage someone to take agency over their own learning, to exhibit curiosity and wonder, and to find joy and delight in what they're doing in our spaces. A second model is Keller's ARCS model of learning. Now, this theory doesn't specifically call out the word play, but when you compare this model with the Pedagogy of Play, you can see that motivating a learner to learn requires a lot of the same elements that you see in the Pedagogy of Play. ARCS is an acronym, and it stands for attention, which we capture by using inquiry and various methods; relevance, which we can construct by matching their motivations, whether they're personal motivations or social motivations. We talked a little bit about that in episode 21. We match their motivations with our content. That's how we create relevance. The C stands for confidence, which we give them by giving them choices and allowing them to move along this learning journey on their own successfully. That builds confidence in learning. And the S stands for satisfaction, which we offer through intrinsic enjoyment. So again, these connect very clearly back to this idea of autonomous learning, fostering wonder by searching out the unknown and finding delight in what you're doing along the way. So in the end, it seems like just how a rose by any other name smells as sweet, play by any other name, whether we call it personal motivation or embodied learning or choice in learning, it's all engagement, which is what we're after in the museum field in the first place. And by the way, if you think about it broadly, playful activities are just as engaging for adults as they are for kids. But again, with adults, we often hesitate to call it play. And I think this stems directly from that patriarchal and childish influences on our society. So clearly, I have a lot to say about museums and play and the connection between them and what hinders and what encourages play in our spaces. We have just barely scratched the surface here today. I am really fascinated by how we play in museums and whether or not and how it impacts or not the learning that happens in that space. So you can definitely expect more on this topic in the future. I'm guessing that this is a topic that you probably have some opinions and thoughts on. And if that is true, I would love to hear from you. So please feel free to contact me. My contact information is in the show notes, and I would love to hear more about what you think play in the museum looks like and where you see, if you see, a distinction between play and learning. And if you have a specific question that you would like to ask me about play in the museum, be sure to join us in the Engagement Lab, because this is a topic that we are diving into. And there you can ask me your question directly. Or if you want to get a little bit more hands-on, feel free to schedule a call with me. We can talk about how we can bring some play-focused professional development directly to your staff. All the links you need are in the show notes, or you can just head to my website, modernmuseumeducation.com, to find everything that you need. Now, I know that this week was a lot of theory, and it was very focused in our brains. Next week, we're going to move on from this research heavy information and jump into some practical strategies applying these principles so that you can plan engaging intergenerational programs that use playful elements, whether or not you feel comfortable calling it play in your museum or not. So we'll talk more about that next week. But in the meantime, friends, keep your research close and the craft glue closer. And I'll see you next time. Thanks for being here today. If this episode helped you, please subscribe, forward to a friend, leave a review, send me an email. It's all great ways to help other museum educators find the show and help me know how best to serve you. As always, you can find the show notes, the resources, and all the ways to work with me at modernmuseumeducation.com. I'll see you back here next time. And remember, your work isn't childish just because you work with children.